I'd like to welcome you all on this very special event, and obviously one that we're all interested in. My name is Irma Ranieri, and I'm speaking to you as the President of the South Australian Division of the Institute of Public Administration Australia. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge this land that we meet on today is a traditional land for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people attending from other areas of South Australia and Australia here. This week is National Reconciliation Week. The vision for this week's festivities is Walk the Talk, which is about doing more than just talking about reconciliation. I would encourage you all to consider how you might become involved in something that demonstrates you are walking the talk. Information on the events happening around South Australia can be found on the National Reconciliation Week 2014 website. I'd like to acknowledge our very special guest, the Hon Jay Weatherill MP, Premier of South Australia, and our speaker for today. I'd also like to acknowledge the Honourable Susan Close MP, Minister for Manufacturing, Innovation and Trade, and Minister for the Public Sector. I'd like to welcome, there's so many here so I can't name you all, the mayors and chief executive officers from local government, the chief executives from the state public sector, and Commissioner Bruce Lander, and of course all of you as our special guests. Housekeeping, can you please place your phones on silent or turn them off, but I don't think we can't do the Twitter if we turn them off. If there is an emergency, we need to evacuate, please follow the staff as they lead you outside. So, introducing the Premier today is a very special occasion, as it marks the first address to the public sector by the Premier since the March election. An election is always a very exciting and tense time for the public sector, and I think that the 2014 was no exception. Leading up to the election, the government laid out a series of in-depth policies for consideration by the electorate. It is a policy agenda that covers a wide variety of economic and social spheres and, tellingly, culminates in the policy for building a modern public service. The policy agenda is challenging, as are the times in which they've been written. Just a personal note, over the last 18 months, I personally have witnessed a period of renewal within the public sector as a CE of the Office for the Public Sector Renewal Program. And I want to thank everyone in this room that has been involved and part of that journey. I can only say that I've seen and worked with some of the most passionate and innovative public servants that are wanting change and want to be at the forefront of shaping a new way of doing business. In many parts, we're already doing this. I know this because we're now collaborating with our national and international partners, with community groups, citizens and the private sector. There is a lot we can learn from each other and much to gain by working together. I believe that South Australia has long innovated in the realm of government, both in policy and service delivery. How we accelerate this is really a key question, and I look forward to hearing from the Premier. While I'm sure introductions are not necessary, let me simply remind you that the Premier is the member for Cheltenham and the 45th Premier of this state. Today the Premier will speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll take some questions from the floor. There's microphones for people to ask those questions. And now I'd like to welcome the Premier, Hon Jay Weatherill, Premier for South Australia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Irma, and I'm really pleased to be here addressing you in my first major speech in this area of the public sector reform, because it speaks to something that I actually believe passionately, and that is a quality public service is actually central to the well-being and prosperity of the citizens of South Australia. I've always seen our public sector as not a burden to be minimised, if you believe the screeching headlines of the weekend of today's Australian, but rather an asset whose value we must maximise. And that's been at the heart of my thinking about public sector reform ever since I've been involved in it, and we want to accelerate that process. So I want to thank you for coming here today and tell you that one of the reasons I'm standing here is because a minimum basic requirement of presenting yourself for re-election is to present a competent government. And the truth is, the competence of the government is largely reflected through the capacity of its public sector. The public sector is the government taking action. And so in a very real sense, I owe my job to the work that you've done across the whole of the public sector. I'd like to acknowledge my ministerial colleague, Dr Susan Close, many agency heads that are here, my state and local government colleagues, and welcome to this important event. I also would like to acknowledge that we gather today on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. Well, a generation of politicians lined up to gleefully announce that the era of big government was over. Today I'm here to tell you that in South Australia the era of quality modern government services has arrived. Abdication of responsibility and cuts to services has been hidden behind a rhetorical veil of greater public choice for too long. Government is an expression of the common good, but we in the public services sector have the responsibility to maximise the potential of each taxpayer's dollar spent. Quality transport, education, health are reliant on the public service, the bureaucrats, the doctors who work in our great public sector. We're kept safe by police officers and firefighters who are public servants. There are more than 100,000 people working in public service jobs. It is the largest workforce in South Australia. And they do help us build not only a strong community, but a prosperous one. Public servants help keep South Australia's mining and energy sectors growing. They keep our streets orderly and safe. They run the transport networks that help us get around. In fact, there's no part of South Australia's economic, social or cultural history that cannot trace its beginnings to the involvement of high-quality public sector. I was just reading the history of the beginning of Santos, South Australian Northern Territory oil search, the largest single company in South Australia. And it all started with a government geologist. Just like so many stories started here in South Australia. This notion that there's the public sector and the private sector, one's good and one's a burden, is just completely ahistorical. It completely ignores South Australia's economic, social and cultural history. And when we actually are confronted with challenges, once again, it's the public service. They're imagining and executing important government initiatives such as our jobs plan, the response to the Holden closure. And we know the Holdens is closing in around 2017. An immediate response was required. About 13,000 South Australians potentially affected by that closure. Government clearly has a role to play in securing future opportunities for these workers. Our jobs plan, designed and calibrated by Cabinet Ministers with the enormous support of intelligent public services, help design an industry development plan to support growth and secure South Australia's future prosperity. Part of the plan is already underway. A 90-day change project has been established to create a one-stop shop for Holden employees in the northern region. And this approach has been extended to ensure that affected employees in southern and western regions are also provided with much needed support. A small government approach would not have been able to even imagine there was a role for government in that response, would not have been able to respond with the sense of urgency or proportion necessary to help these South Australians who are at a critical juncture in their life, who are asking themselves questions now about what is my future. We need an open, modern public service known for excellence. We spend far too much time talking about the size of the public sector rather than the quality of its people and their work. But the search for excellence never ends. Our Labor government believes the government should be open, nimble and efficient, a vestige of excellence that exists to serve the community. In the months leading up to the election, we released 14 key policy statements, themselves crafted and supported by our public service, but one of them was specifically designed and spoke to the public sector. It was called a modern public service. This policy recognised that our public servants were that asset I spoke about, an asset which was probably the single most important resource we have in our state, and not some burden that should be cut. It reflected our belief that we can do more to use the expertise and professionalism of those working in the public service, and frankly those that have left the public service. The modern public service policy is a culmination of reform programs that have been underway since 2002, with many new and expanded initiatives. We introduced collective performance pay for chief executives. Chief executives of government departments will be required to demonstrate how they work collaboratively to deliver services and improve productivity. Probably the most commonly used phrase in public sector discourse is whole of government, but probably the least delivered upon. This is and it's because it's difficult. The Westminster system of government has all of the accountabilities running up and down silos, not vertically across government. And it does require people to think imaginatively and challenge some of those structures, which are all heading in a different direction. And simply by bringing agencies together, it's not enough. You can even be on the same floor and have a lack of collaboration. I can remember famously when I used to run my own very small business, we had a petition and we actually had workforce organisational problems in a 15-person office just because of one simple petition. You don't need very many divisions and barriers to workplace culture to actually have silos emerge. So this is a constant matter that needs to be grappled with and worked upon. As part of that policy, we announced 200 administrative trainee places on offer to 17 to 24-year-olds across South Australia. The Jobs for Youth SA program is targeted at young people without VET or tertiary qualifications who can apply for roles across metropolitan and country areas in the public service. These young people are already reinvigorating and helping shape a modern public sector. Some of you might have been aware that since the election I've been carrying out pretty random visits to public sector agencies, much to the consternation of the chief executives, but I do. So I might emerge on a floor near you soon. And what I was able to see actually was, I thought surprisingly, given we only just announced it, but the Jobs for Youth program, young people actually there playing a key role in the change process. And it clearly was reinvigorating the agencies where these young people had emerged. I was also pleased to see the exciting new initiative Simplify. Obviously, we've seen the banners up around the place, but to actually see it in operation in an agency, the fantastic ideas that are emerging from the agencies, both in terms of how people interact within government agencies, how they face the community, how they face the business sector, fantastic, simple, new initiatives which are all about cutting red tape. South Australians were asked to submit their ideas with top 100 ideas to be published and implemented, and we're working through those ideas now. Engaging with as many people as possible will help us continue to build a public service focused on providing all South Australians with the high quality and efficient services they need. We announced the Charter of Public Service Guarantee, which we developed to ensure that every customer knows the treatment and service they can expect to receive from government agencies. People accept that things go wrong. What they want to know is that there is service recovery when things go wrong, that it's not going to be hidden, that it's not going to be told that your subjective experience is wrong, but that your complaint will be taken seriously and there will be a response. And that's critical. That's a critical element of the Charter of Public Service Guarantee. The policy also included, the modern public service policy included a further round of 90-day projects which aim to find the solutions to complex community problems within 3 months. And these 90-day projects have played a critically important role in driving our public sector culture change program. The truth is, after 90 days, if you haven't come up with a solution, you're probably stuck. And it's good to have that focus, that capacity to actually have a beginning and an end to a project so one can evaluate it and it doesn't just get lost with a series of other intractable problems that exist across government. And there have been some fantastic results already. The 90-day projects have provided an opportunity to develop a more flexible and direct approach within government. Some have been immediately successful, while other projects have not achieved their intended outcomes, but that's been important in itself. But no idea has fallen into a state of inertia, and that's the critical, I think, genius behind the 90-day projects. We want this concept of the 90-day project to join up and be just how we do business all of the time about all of the issues that confront us. So the public sector needs to use these projects to drive cultural change in agencies, and over the course of the next year, key agencies will develop their own change programs. I'm very pleased to see a number of agencies are already doing this. The government wants to see agencies learning from their experience through the Change at SA and applying those lessons to create ongoing cultural change, something that becomes self-generating, not something that has to be the subject of a specific project. The culture of the public sector ultimately rests not in the hands of chief executives, but in the hands of every single member of the public service. I think we've now arrived at a point where the modern best practice about managing any organisation, let alone the public sector, is to ensure that we have leaders in all elements of the organisation, that there is the notion of collective leadership, that each of us takes responsibility within our own sphere to be leaders. And of course that needs to be driven by chief executives, but it fundamentally has to be accepted by every person within the organisation. If we're to transform the way that government is considered in South Australia, if we're to make the public sector a mark of quality and excellence, we depend on change that springs from within the public service. We can't rely upon consultants coming in and telling us what to think or external pressures. We have to own this change ourselves. And part of our election commitment, we have created the Office for the Public Sector. The new office will be headed by Irma as Chief Executive. Irma has already demonstrated, obviously, extraordinary leadership in her role as heading the Change at SA program, and we've got very high hopes for this new agency. By taking on the leadership role of the new Office for the Public Sector, she will ensure the proper integration of all of its functions, including leadership development, workforce planning, cultural change, partnership building across sectors, industrial relations, workforce wellbeing, and the South Australian Executive Service. We want public sector chief executives to assume collective responsibility for the performance of the sector, rather than focusing on their own organisations. That's why we've introduced collective performance agreements for the Senior Management Council. These agreements cover the high performance framework, the implementation of the public sector values, and involvement in the 90-day change project. So we all have a stake in this, because the truth is, if we cannot win the public debate about the quality of our public service, we're going to continue to face these mindless calls for cuts and deep cuts into the public sector. We all have a responsibility to achieve a more collegiate approach to the work of government. We all need to ensure that we're guided by and are responsible for our public sector values. Those values are an expression of who we are as public servants. They're also founded on our existing strong traditions of service and professionalism. We must renew our commitment to these values. I've asked the new Office for Public Sector to integrate the values in the Code of Ethics to provide a single reference point for direction on professional conduct and performance. So these values should be the things that guide how we actually reward and how we also deal with questions of discipline. I mean, we have to consult our values if we are serious about those values. We believe that South Australia is stronger when we have a strong public service, but we also know that the strong public service only works in collaboration with other important areas of civil society. The business sector, academia, and the broader community needs to be fully involved in our work. More than ever before, a productive and growing economy relies on innovation that will only come through deep collaboration across sectors. So the current debate about the size of government is informed by the perception that by nature government lacks the capacity to innovate and create. And it's just simply wrong. The internet, computers, laser satellites were all products of innovation that occurred within governments in particular in the United States. The private sector has traditionally benefited from such innovations. And I believe that this is central to the role of government to create opportunities for business for the benefit of the community. Our government has a number of initiatives in place to build collaboration with the business and community sectors, and through Change at SA, agencies have been partnering with other sectors on these 90-day projects. They've addressed a range of issues such as the one I mentioned before, the transition for automotive workers, identifying opportunities for industry growth, improving social wellbeing for young people in communities, and managing better partnerships on building affordable housing and getting more services to businesses online. So there obviously is an enormous effort going on across government at the moment to confront the reality of shrinking resources but growing demands for government to be easier to work with. And I want to pay tribute to all of the work that's going on in terms of our red tape reduction schemes across government. The Simplify programs, the red tape reduction programs that are occurring in many agencies are throwing up many exciting and valuable ideas. But a modern public service is one that responds to the needs of a modern society. We have to be relevant to the political, economic and social context in which we operate. For better or for worse, people are time poor these days. We need to make services simpler to access and understand. Every time a South Australian receives impeccable service from a government agency, their perception of government changes. Even when something goes wrong, if they see speedy service recovery, their perception of government changes. Every time a South Australian who relies on a government service and walks away satisfied, their faith in the public sector, and from my perspective, their faith in government as an instrument of good, where vulnerable people are protected within a social framework, is renewed. And I want to pay an important tribute to the role that IPA can play in the life of public service. Strong public service is a vital feature of this state, and public servants should feel proud of their profession. Our public servants deserve a professional association that's willing to raise complex and at times controversial issues and to challenge conventional ways of doing business. Now, you have the year of our government, but we want you to work to improve the standing of the public sector more broadly in the South Australian community. The result of the most recent state election does provide that opportunity. We obviously are facing some very big challenges arising out of the federal budget, and we are going to try and grapple with those in a way which protects our public services here in South Australia. But that will be a challenge for us. As I said before, since our election victory, I have been visiting public sector offices across the city, and I'm going to continue to do that over the coming weeks and months. But central to everything we do over the next 4 years will be the starting point that the public sector is an incredibly important and valuable part of our future prosperity and the well-being of our citizens. And I want to thank all of you for the work you do. Thank you.